sorry for that.
That's okay.
It's the first time we've had it
Yeah,
happen.
first time I've been Zoom bombed as well. Well, yeah, I guess I can just pick up kind of where we left off. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons for focusing on conserving pollinators. You know, one of them is that pollinators are just hugely important for the health of ecosystems across the world. There's quite a bit of research now that shows that about 90% of all flowering plants require animal pollination. So without pollinators, these plants would not be able to reproduce and would quickly die out. And pollinators are also crucial for producing the food that we eat. So about 3/4 of the crop types grown around the world are animal pollinated. And about 35% of the total food volume produced is pollinator dependent. So most of the remaining 65% are wind pollinated grains like wheat and corn. But it's kind of cool to think about, about every third bite of food on average is brought to you by pollinators. There's also a lot of emphasis on conserving pollinators these days because many pollinators are struggling. So there's increasing evidence of declines even in populations of pollinators that once thought to be abundant. For example, a 2017 study found that about a quarter of North American bumblebee species are now threatened or near threatened. And beekeepers this past year reported losses of averaging about 60% in their managed honeybee hives in the latest US beekeeping survey. And the monarch butterfly in its various ranges has declined steeply in recent decades. As you may know already, there are two major populations of monarchs that migrate in the US. In the eastern US, those butterflies travel up from Mexico in the spring, and then several generations they return to Mexico in the fall. And these populations have declined about 80% in the last few decades. And in the western US, the population overwinters on the coast of California from about northern Marin County or so down to the US-Mexico border, including several of the counties that we're working in through this Project Wingspan project. So they spend several months in trees along the California coast, then fly inland when the weather warms and things start to bloom. The Western population has seen significant declines from over 1 million in 1997 to just over 9,000 in 2024, despite an increase in the number of sites that were monitored. So it's troubling that those two trends have gone in kind of different directions, the number of or the amount of effort that's put into monitoring and the number of monarchs that are seen. So in 2014, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned to protect the monarch butterfly under the Endangered Species Act. And in December of 2024, the Fish and Wildlife Service officially proposed protections for the monarchs as an endangered species. So along with this protection, the Fish and Wildlife Service urged public engagement to help save the species. Then is a grassroots pollinator conservation effort aimed at creating high quality pollinator habitat with a particular focus on habitat for the monarch butterfly. So Project Wingspan is really a series of efforts that were started and are managed by Pollinator Partnership, starting in the Midwest back in 2016. And they've expanded to various states, as well as Ontario, Canada, and most recently to California. And through this project, we work with volunteers to collect native local ecotype seed in the wild. We amplify it and we provide it for free to habitat planting projects in the area where the seed came from. So we want to increase the supply of native seed and plants, and we want to use that to produce more pollinator habitat. So just this year, with funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Project Wingspan Golden State, we've begun to work in Northern California. And Project Wingspan Golden State is currently active in the counties that you see on this map. But yeah, Alameda, Marin, Contra Costa, San Mateo, Lake, Sonoma, Napa, and Mendocino counties. And I'll go into more detail about exactly how we do this in a moment, but wanted to give a little more background, a little more information about who exactly these pollinators are that we're trying to conserve through this project. So often when people think about pollinators, they think of these, the European honeybee. And this makes sense because they're everywhere, both on the landscape and in pop culture and marketing. They also carry out a ton of the pollination services for many of the crops that we eat. So they're an extremely important resource for growers and a major part of the modern agricultural system in general. But they actually aren't native to North America. They arrived in the early 1600s with European colonists who actually assumed that there weren't bees in the New World and thought that honeybee hives were therefore needed if they were going to grow much of anything. And these days, sometimes honeybees can kind of overshadow the many important native pollinators that are also struggling. So saving honeybees has become sort of a rallying cry for pollinators more broadly. But from a conservation standpoint, we often say that getting some honeybee hives in order to help pollinators more generally is sort of analogous to getting chickens in order to help songbirds. So chickens and honeybees are both really important domesticated animals, but are very different in key ways from their wild relatives. So on the flip side, there are many native pollinators out there that can use our attention, including over 4,000 species of native bees in North America alone. For example, there's a leafcutter bee here on the bottom left with a leaf in its mouth, and a mason bee above that on the top left, along with moths and butterflies and birds and wasps and bats and flies and beetles. And in some cases, in other parts of the world, even amphibians and small mammals can actually be important pollinators of certain plants. And bees are often the ones that are doing the kind of heavy lifting when it comes to pollination in both natural and agricultural settings. So this slide shows some of the range of native bee species around the world. Some are really hairy and with long antennae. Others are small and shiny metallic green. But there are a few things that they all have in common that make them the most efficient pollinators out there. It's mostly that they spend most of their time collecting pollen from flowers, which they then feed to their offspring. So busy as a bee is kind of an apt description. Many other pollinators will visit flowers searching mostly for nectar, like moths and butterflies or hummingbirds, and they'll collect pollen, but sort of by accident, by sort of bumping into the pollen while they're feeding on those flowers. But bees are really there for the nectar, but really for the pollen as well, targeting that as they visit various flowers. And their bodies are also just really built to collect pollen really well. So they often have dense hairs that collect pollen, kind of like a feather duster. And they also build up an electrostatic charge as they fly between flowers. So when they land, they actually attract the pollen to those hairs, when they land on the flower, so they can quickly collect quite a bit before moving on to the next flower. And California is a pretty interesting place in terms of native bee diversity. There are over 1,600 species of native bees in the state, largely due to the range in elevation and the various different kind of microclimates and habitats throughout the state. So that number is higher than any other state in the U.S. I will add a caveat there that Arizona has also an extremely high diversity of different native bee species, but California just, with the larger landmass has more species overall. It's also interesting to note that there have been some studies in California that find that about a quarter of these 1,600 species have been found in urban pollinator garden areas. So even in an area largely lacking in habitat, if you provide the resources needed, a surprising diversity of bees will likely visit and benefit from those efforts. We also have the largest number of pollen specialist bees of any state. More on that in a few minutes. And we also have the smallest bee in the world in Southern California, the fairy bee or Perdita minima. And this bee is about 2 to 3 millimeters long, so it's really easy to miss out there. You can see it here resting on the eye of a carpenter bee, which is a much larger bee. It kind of gives you an idea of the variety of bees out there in shape and size. And although I have kind of a bee bias, there are lots of other pollinators out there that are also very important and each fit into their own ecological niche. For example, hoverflies that you see on the bottom right are both good pollinators, but also really good at controlling pests. So lots of pollinators out there, and they all kind of serve their own purpose. And looks like one image is missing of a monarch caterpillar, but as I mentioned earlier, this project has a big focus on the monarch butterfly and its host plant milkweeds. So with their really incredible migration throughout the country and throughout so many different areas, monarchs are a really important part of the ecosystem. And I'm gonna have a little water. And a really important part of the ecosystem and really valuable in sort of stoking a sense of wonder and engagement with pollinator conservation. So there are a number of things that pollinators need in their habitat and that we're aiming to provide through this effort. I think it's helpful to kind of think about a number of different levels of pollinator habitat quality. And the first level is to come at it from an angle of kind of do no harm and create areas that are free of insecticide use or drift. This creates an area that can be home to pollinators kind of in the first place, where they can get a foothold without exposing them to chemicals that can be really harmful. The next thing to think about is providing some sort of flowering pollen and nectar producing plants. As a very general rule of thumb, it takes about 5 flowers, the pollen from 5 flowers, on average to produce 1 adult bee. And again, that pollen is fed to the bee when it's laid as an egg, and then the larva will consume the pollen and then emerge as an adult. So even a few dandelions and a turf grass lawn would be better than only mowed turf grass. But this is obviously sort of the bare bones kind of pollinator habitat. The best option there is to have local ecotype native vegetation that provides nectar and pollen to the various kinds of pollinators out there. Native species are generally going to provide resources that are better matched in terms of timing and nutrition to the pollinators that are visiting them. The next step in habitat quality is to provide species that will bloom across multiple seasons. So a good sort of goal here is 3 species blooming in each season, because there are pollinators active at different times of the year. So having something blooming in each season will provide resources to feed them while they're active at different times. Oh. And there should be a bloom chart here, but through Project Wingspan, we're collecting seed from species that bloom throughout the season. So we're collecting species that bloom in the early spring, into the summer, and species that bloom later in the late summer and fall, like asters and goldenrods. It's also good to provide nesting habitats for bees because 30% of bee species make nests in cavities, like the ones you might have seen in a bee hotel. The bees tunnel into these holes. In the wild, these would be caused by beetles drilling into a tree or hollow stems of plants. And they create compartments in which they lay their eggs. And for the other 70% of native bees, it's similar, except they create these chambers in the ground. So providing open bare space and leaving stems of old plants on the ground can create a home for these pollinators. Additionally, having plants with different flower morphologies can help support a wider variety of pollinator types. For example, California fuchsias, tube-like red flowers are really magnets for hummingbirds because they have these long tongues that can reach deep into the flower. And the flowers of lupins are best suited for larger bees, especially bumblebees, because the bee has to land on the flower and kind of swing those lower petals out of the way to reach the pollen and nectar. And then the final thing I'll mention as far as creating habitat is to try to support the widest range of pollinators by looking at host plants of Lepidoptera or moths and butterflies and pollen specialist bees. So host plants for Lepidoptera or moths or butterflies are plants that the caterpillars can eat before turning into adults. So these are important because many moths and butterflies can only consume pretty specific types of plants, like the monarch butterfly that can only eat the species in the Asclepias or milkweed genus. And then pollen specialist bees are those that can only consume pollen from specific plants. And sometimes that's plants, throughout a specific family, or sometimes it's down to the genus or even species level sometimes. And if you're curious about this, there's a really detailed list of pollen specialist bees of the Western US. It was compiled by a guy named Jared Fowler on his website here. I could probably send this link out as a follow-up after this presentation as well, so you can take a look at it. But it lists many different bee species and the plant species that they can forage from. So, oh shoot. Here, I might just refresh my slides real quick. Because there should be an image there. Okay, hopefully you can see that okay. But yeah, this on this website you can see for different types of bees, different species of native bees, what kind of plants they can forage on. So, for example, this species of longhorn bee or Metasotes is highly specialized on species in the Clarkia genus. So it might feed on the wine cup Clarkia or farewell to spring that we're targeting through our collection efforts. So without Clarkias, you wouldn't see this bee in the area. And another kind of interesting side note related to pollen specialists is that in the eastern US, there is a pollen specialist bee that specializes on pollen from the American chestnut tree. And as you might know, chestnut is now mostly wiped out in the wild due to blight, but and because of this, it was assumed that this species of bee that was reliant on that pollen was extinct too. It wasn't seen since the early 1900s, but fairly recently it was actually seen visiting some of the groves that are managed by various groups that are trying to revive the American chestnut tree and breed it to be resistant to the blight. So it was thought to be surviving on Chinkapin for that 100 years or so, and now that there are some efforts to revive its preferred host plant, the chestnut. It's been seen in some of those groves of kind of test or experimental trees that are being bred. So surviving on a relatively close relative of the chestnut tree, but I'm sure it's pretty relieved to see chestnut trees, popping up at least in some areas again. So in order to create this kind of high quality pollinator habitat, Project Wingspan is working on a few main things. The first is to create a regional seed collection program, and we're working with partners and existing collection efforts to create a coordinated regional seed collection and distribution network in these target counties. So we hope that the skills that our volunteers learn can be applied, both to our efforts, but also local efforts, and support local conservation capacity into the future. Because locally specific native milkweed and other native seeds is usually commercially unavailable in large quantities in many areas, or it can be prohibitively expensive for some projects, even when it is available. So there just aren't that many places where you can buy wholesale source identified native seed. So our goal is to help try to change that. We're hoping to increase the overall supply of local ecotype seed from the landscape, which will then be used for enhancing pollinator habitat throughout the Bay Area. And so through Project Wingspan Golden State, we're working to target a number of species in our seed collecting. These are some of the species here that on the screen, which were selected to provide pollen and nectar resources throughout the growing season, to fuel the monarch's migration, as well as to sustain other residential imperiled pollinators in the area. And many of them provide these much needed host plants for monarchs and other species of moths and butterflies. And I've mentioned that term local ecotype a few times now, and really that's just seed that is from a specific area and will be returned to that area for planting. So it's seed that has been there for a long time, has been able to adapt really well to the specific conditions of that area. Because even among certain species like California poppies, populations in different areas can have different genetic adaptations. So they've lived there a long time. They've gotten really good at reproducing there. So poppies in Southern California are going to be really well adapted to hotter and drier and sunnier conditions, whereas California poppies, in the same species but found in coastal Marin County, are going to be much more well adapted to milder summers, cooler temperatures overall, much more fog than in other parts of the state. And some poppy seeds are even grown abroad, like in India or other parts of the world, because that species in particular has become really popular and has kind of moved up in the seed industry overall. But as you can imagine, a place like India is going to have very different growing conditions from anywhere found in the state of California. So planting locally adapted seed increases the likelihood that the plants will get established well and do well in the long term. It also reduces the likelihood of outbreeding depression. So that happens when seeds from a very different genetic makeup come to an area where seed has been well adapted for the conditions of a site, and they kind of just water down those adaptations that have taken a long time to develop. So it kind of reduces the overall viability of that population. So that's something that we want to avoid. And there are lots of different ways of kind of defining how large or where an ecotype is. One common way is to look at provisional seed transfer zones, which is why I put it on the slide here. These are, each different color you see are different areas of relatively similar growing conditions and where it's generally considered, feasible to move a seed within that same area and it will do well. But the scale can differ quite a bit. Sometimes it can be, one specific meadow that is considered the ecotype. Other times it could be on a watershed or county level. And here looking at California, you can see compared to the eastern US especially, there's a lot more variation in the different seed transfer zones. Kind of reflects just the overall variety in growing conditions and ecosystems within the state, which causes so much diversity in the first place and in plants and animals within the state, like the native bees that I mentioned earlier. But it can make it somewhat harder to successfully take seed from one area of the state and plant it somewhere else and expect it to do well. So our second goal is to provide technical assistance and training for seed collection and planting. We want to ensure well-planned and responsible collections are conducted. So we've developed standardized seed collection protocols that can be used throughout our region that we're working in. And we're wanting to make sure that we train our volunteers in plant identification and proper collection methods. We want our volunteers to be confident in their abilities and have all the resources that they need to make successful and sustainable seed collections. The third goal is to enhance long-term habitat. So we're collecting a lot of seed. We're going to have it cleaned and grown out as plants and amplified. But then at the end of the project, we'll provide these plant materials, these seeds and plants for free to various qualified planting projects back in the same ecotype where it was collected. So we'll have an application that can be filled out and based on the number of seeds and plugs available at the end of the project, which will be in this case in 2026, we'll figure out how much we can send where. But we want to send materials to long-term projects. So we do have a letter of agreement that those projects will sign just to ensure that we'll be managing those sites indefinitely. But in general, we work with projects that are going to be managing those sites for a long time, like land trust easements or parks and preserves. But as far as what this process looks like, on the ground, we start out with the wildland seed collections that I've sort of described, but we're having people go out to these parks and preserves and collecting seeds from those native plant species there. And as far as how we exactly collect the seed on the ground, we'll be going to a number of sites and areas that we have permits for, and that's an important thing to note. In general, we do need to get permits to collect at these sites like state parks or others. Sometimes that can be as simple as just getting an email approval from a landowner saying that we're going to collect this or that and get their approval. But sometimes it can be a pretty lengthy and kind of elaborate permit process. So we've been working to secure those permits, and we do have a number of them now for projects or sites throughout the Bay Area. And when we collect seed, we follow this Seeds of Success protocol created by the Bureau of Land Management. And this just kind of helps us ensure that we are getting genetically diverse collections of seeds. And to do this, we'll collect randomly from a pretty diverse selection of plants, kind of regardless of their characteristics. Even in an area, if an area has really a dense clump of plants that would be really easy to collect from, we'll try to spread out and collect from other individuals throughout the landscape. We also try to include seed from all the different microhabitats throughout the site, such as areas that are maybe lower and wetter or drier parts of the site on a, maybe a steeper south-facing slope. And this just kind of incorporates, plants with more genetic variation, more adapted to slightly different growing conditions within that same area. And this can help because it just sort of provides more resilience to all the different conditions that are increasingly being thrown at native plants by climate change. And it's important to not only collect from plants that look, the biggest or the most showy, even though this can be pretty tempting. But we don't necessarily want to avoid, those shorter or kind of scraggly or otherwise different or weird looking plants because they may have characteristics that could be really beneficial and kind of help them flourish under different growing conditions. We also want to make sure that when collecting seeds, we don't harm the collection site populations and that there's plenty of seed left over after collections to perform, its kind of natural ecosystem function. So general best practices are to collect no more than 20% of any individual's plant seed or from 20% of the individuals on a site. But often we're collecting less, like 5 or 10%, just kind of based on the guidance or preference from the site managers. But yeah, generally speaking, we want to leave around 80% of the seed there so that it can ensure that there's plenty of seed for replenishing future populations. And that's especially important for annuals because that, next year's seed is what they really rely on to continue growing on that site. So if we took too much from that population, it could cause a decline on that site. And timing for seed collection can be really important. So many species past a certain point will release their seeds and we won't really be able to collect them anymore. So for example, milkweeds will eventually pop open and release their wind dispersed seeds. You've probably seen these before. They've got sort of almost like a parachute on them that will carry them in the wind and they can travel pretty far that way. But if we go too late, we'll have dispersed all those seeds and they'll be far away at that point. But if we go too early and the pod is really green still, those seeds won't be viable. So it's kind of a waste of efforts trying to collect those if they're not going to grow eventually. So it requires a lot of scouting after these sites. So I've been traveling kind of all over the Bay Area the last few months to see where things are growing and when things are blooming and when things are producing seeds and when those are going to be ready. Trying to get that timing just right so when we plan out these collection events, we can collect the seed when it is kind of the optimal level of ripeness. So that ideal case is kind of when the seed is ripe but hasn't dispersed, like in the photo here on the right of a showy milkweed pod that's still holding all of its seed in there. So it's all ripe and could probably germinate well, but it hasn't flown off and been lost for collections. And in seed collecting, often equipment is moved from one site to another, and there's not a ton of equipment really needed for this. But it always involves people, who have been visiting different sites, and we don't want to spread potential, non-target species from one site to another. And these non-target species are the plants and animals and pathogens and parasites that are not intended to be moved from one site to another and can cause harm if they do. So a lot of invasive species, also pathogens like Phytophthora. So to reduce the risk of this happening or reduce the impact, we educate volunteers on weed identification in the field, and we remain cognizant of the seeds that may cling to our clothing and gear, like some of the weed seeds that you see in the pictures here. And cleaning plant and dirt from our shoes can be really important, and sanitizing things can be really important especially when we're collecting in areas that may be affected by Phytophthora or sudden oak death. So our motto with all of our efforts when we're out there is to come clean and leave clean, trying to reduce the amount of materials that we're bringing to the site. And we have resources on our website that can help with weed identification and go over the protocols in more detail. And they can help you target those or locate those target species, identify those, and see when the right time to collect might be. But once the seed is collected, we have to do a few things. We first have to dry it, and this could take a few days to a month or 6 weeks sometimes. And this is important to ensure that when we package it up and send it to the nursery, it doesn't mold, because that could kind of put all of our efforts up to that point down the drain, and we definitely want to avoid losing any seed to that. But when it is dry, we package it up and we send it to Heritage Growers, which is a native seed nursery and seed farm in the Central Valley. They're located in Colusa. They're one of only 3 native seed farms in California that can specialize in local-ecotype source identified seed. So they actually have over 100 different species in production. I think it's maybe 200 or 300 acres that they have total. So it's pretty incredible to think about growing that many species, especially considering a lot of farms might have one species or just a handful of different crops that they grow. But Heritage Growers is kind of at the forefront of just figuring out how to grow all these different native forb species and grasses. So they've got a really cool operation going there, and we're working with them for this project. Once the seed gets there, it's cleaned and tested to remove debris and get an estimate of how many of those seeds are viable, or the number of pure live seeds in that mix. They have a lot of huge machines that can sort out the seed and plant debris by size and weight to get to pretty clean seed. And there are lots of different seed, capsule and pod shapes out there. For example, the lupin and blue-eyed grass here, and the goldenrod seed and milkweeds. So these all require somewhat different harvesting techniques and cleaning techniques at Heritage Growers, and especially with like I mentioned, the 100 or more species that Heritage Growers is growing out there. They've really had to figure a lot out and kind of learn as they go, and learn how to both grow all these species at scale, but also clean and manage all these species. So once the seed is cleaned, it's either amplified, which means it's planted in fields at the farm. Often these are either 1/10 of an acre or maybe 1/4 of an acre in size. But they grow the seed there, and then it's harvested at the end of the season. So the idea is to take a somewhat small amount of seed that's collected on the landscape that has those important genetic adaptations, and then grow it at Heritage Growers, get a lot more seed from that relatively small amount, and then it can be returned to the landscape with a lot of those same genetics intact. But a portion of the seed is also grown as plugs. So some species don't really do that well by just broadcast seeding them at a site. Like milkweeds are a good example. There's kind of hard to grow in any sort of setting, either as in a greenhouse as live plants or seeded. So those would be a good one to grow as plugs and kind of give them a head start and a little bit more care throughout the process. Other species like Clarkias or California poppies do really pretty well as seed. So these would be probably seeded at the farm and amplified and harvested and then given to sites as seed. So after the seed is amplified and cleaned or grown as plugs, they're either given to well, the plugs are given to projects. This will be in late 2026 for planting. And then the seed will be given to those projects as well to be broadcast seeded. And we give these materials away thanks to the grant funding that we have for this project. So over the next year or year and a half, we're going to be working to locate those projects, but it might be some of the parks or nonprofit organizations that you might be familiar with. So we're just kind of looking to increase their capacity and remove some of the barriers to planting habitat because it can be quite expensive and can be hard to find the right seed at the right time. So I mentioned some of these things so far, but there are a few ways that you can get involved in this effort, and maybe the most direct and maybe the most fun is to become a trained seed collector. So we have some resources on our website, some videos. They kind of cover a lot of the things that I've talked about today, but we can also provide sort of on the ground, hands-on training. So we are going to be having quite a few events coming up. We just had our first collection up in Sonoma County today, just with the Pollinator Partnership staff. But we're hopefully going to have quite a few other events coming up that you can get involved in, and we can provide the training out there. And it's kind of like hiking, but also searching the ground for treasure. It can be quite a bit of fun. So we'd love it if you join for us. And as collection events are added to the calendar, we can send out an email to this group and let you know about those and where and when they are, and we'll have a sign up sheet for those. But there are a few other ways to get involved as well. So there's if you have a site where there are wild populations of native wildflowers, especially if there are milkweeds, you can allow us to collect on your land, and we could return some of those seed or plugs to the site to be planted. You can also just sort of spread the word, let people know about this project if they might be interested in getting out for some seed collection events. And you can also just check out our website, see some of our online resources, and learn how to plant for pollinators, how to pick the right plants to support various different kinds of pollinators in your area. And if you have any questions, we have a team here in California that are working on this project, and should feel free to reach out anytime. We'd love to talk pollinators and seed, and see how you might be able to get involved in this effort. So with that, yeah, I'll wrap up and just say thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions about this, or if people are interested in getting involved. I'm happy to provide the resources or the contacts for that and the links. Yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, James. And there are some questions in the chat. Also, a question that was answered by someone that was to do with whether bees eat pollen, and yes, some do. And our survey, Eva asks if surveys of plant populations of an area are ever conducted before and after seed collection.
Yeah, that's a good question. We do sort of, go to these areas and scout out, what is there, what's in large enough numbers that would allow us to sort of sustainably collect seed from those plants. But it's mostly kind of marking, where things are in very rough numbers. So it's not like a formal sort of monitoring effort that we do, but some of the sites that we work with, like park districts or preserves that are managed by other nonprofits or other organizations, they do have their own monitoring efforts. So they might do some, but we do some that's fairly simple and just kind of looking at what species are where.
And Paul De Silva asks if you've been in touch with the Marin Monarch Working Group.
Yeah,
Because they do some
directly
work
with
propagating
maybe
local.
the leads of that group. But yeah, I've talked to people that are, I guess, in various ways engaged with that group. But yeah, it seems like there's a lot of overlap with what we're doing and the things that they're trying to do. So they're definitely a group that I'm interested in getting to know more.
Very good. So I've allowed people to unmute themselves again. So if anyone would like to ask a question in person, they could speak up or raise their hand.
I have a question. This is Melissa. I'm sorry, my camera does not work. I work at Casa Grande High School in Petaluma, and I have a gardening class, and I do a lot of stuff with native plants, teaching the kids about, I say pretty is not good enough. We need to be planting for pollinators and stuff. So, anyways, I have a bunch of showy milkweed. And I've heard mixed reviews on whether or not to grow that around here. I'm inclined to think it's actually belongs more like in the foothills. And I have literally like 3 cups of showy milkweed seed that I saved. And now I'm thinking I was going to try to send it up to a native plant society or a conservation organization up in the foothills, but now I'm feeling like maybe I shouldn't do that because I grew it here and maybe I should not be exporting it and maybe I should just compost it. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, yeah, that one is kind of interesting. I've talked with other people that know a lot about where milkweeds grow in the North Bay, and there's some uncertainty about if showy milkweed or Asclepias speciosa is native to this area or more just kind of in the foothills. I think there's quite a bit of evidence that it does grow at least in small areas in the North Bay. So I wouldn't think that it's probably not problematic to grow out there. In general, milkweeds don't grow very close to the coast in California, um, like around 6 miles or so along the coast. They're pretty hard to find. But if you're more inland than that, um, I'd say it's pretty safe to grow it at your location. And I would definitely say don't compost the seed. Milkweed seed is very valuable. So yeah, I would say you could find a home, and that could definitely be your own garden or site that you're managing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I saved it specifically to share. And I
Mhm.
literally, if I packaged this stuff up and charged what you would charge for a seed packet, it's probably like $800 worth of milkweed seeds.
Mhm.
Like I have so much of it. So I need to figure out how to share it with people and what to do because I don't need all of it and I want it to be used, but I don't, like I said, I hear what you're saying. I feel like some people say yes, grow it. Some people say don't. I'm like, well, it's better than the
Mhm.
tropical milkweed, that's
Yeah.
for sure. And of course, I struggle with the orange oleander aphids, which are a real problem on
Mhm.
milkweed. So, anyways, I guess to be continued. I need to figure out what to
Mhm.
do with it. I want to share it. I don't need all of it. It's more than I can use.
Cool. Yeah, I'm sure you can find somebody that would be extremely excited to have that. Um, And just a quick note too about the aphids. Yeah, as you say, they're hard to not have on milkweeds that you're growing, but they can actually be somewhat beneficial. I think there's been some research that shows that the kind of stress that's provided by those aphids on the milkweed plants increases the amount of the toxin in the plant that the monarchs can consume, but is generally really harmful to other species. But it makes the monarchs more toxic, basically, so they're less likely to be preyed on. So there's this interesting sort of connection between aphids milkweed and monarchs, where if the milkweeds are, really happy, no aphids, they don't actually produce as much of the toxic sap, and might not be as attractive to monarch butterflies that could feed on them.
Okay.
So they can actually be sort of a good thing, even though they might not look like it.
They definitely don't look like it, but thank you.
Yeah.
And there's another question in the chat. Bridget Bostow wondered if you could post the
Oh yeah.
the Jared Fowler plant
Yeah,
list.
definitely.
Um,
I'll find that real quick.
And the video and recording of this will be edited, of course, and then posted on our YouTube channel. So that's another place you can go to pick up anything you missed. I know we lost some of the audience during that disruption.
Yeah, and I just sent the link. I think that should have gone to everybody. So
Yes, I see
yeah, let
the
me know if you're seeing that.
chat. It says it's from Anne Elliott because she's as
Oh, right.
co-host is sharing the screen.
Yeah, and that website, the list is really long, but there's some good kind of summary information both at the top and then way at the bottom of the page that kind of highlights some of those really valuable species.
Very good. Well, I think we've come to the end of the questions. So thank you very much, James. Also, thank you for coming back and finishing up, and we will hone our our Zoom skills better. This is the first time it's happened to our chapter, so we'll try to be better prepared for next time. And at any rate,
No worries. I'm glad we could find a
just to
backup
conclude it,
plan.
yeah.
Mhm.
So thank you again, and our speaker for next month isn't finalized yet, but so watch our website and our newsletter for information on that. So thank you again, James, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good rest of your night.
All right. Night, night.